Welcome to this predicted paper from Psychology Ninjas. This paper represents the best guess for the upcoming exams. Please use this paper in addition to your other revision. You can complete a unique version of this paper by going to our Psychology Ninjas site. Psychology Ninjas is full of free content to help you with your exams. You can save your scores with a free account. Which of the statements is not a prod from Milgram's original obedience study? 1 mark. There are two things that we need to note in this question. Firstly, we're looking for not a prod in the study, so we're looking for which one is wrong. We also need to bear in mind that this is Milgram's original or baseline study rather than any variations. We need to look through all the possible answers. Please continue to test the learner. The experiment requires that you continue. You have no other choice, you must go on. Please continue. So the command from the experimenter to the teacher that's not in original baseline is please continue to test the learner, and this is what we would select. Which situational variable for obedience was tested by giving orders over the telephone? 1 mark. This question is looking at a situational variable, something in the environment that is affecting obedience levels. We also need to bear in mind that this is over the telephone, and that's going to be the thing that's affecting our levels of obedience. One of the possible answers is location. This is the environment in which the study took place, which would not be affected by being over the telephone. Next, we have uniform, which would affect the strength of the authority figure. Presence of allies would be a fellow dissenter or someone not following the orders. This would not be affected by giving the orders over the telephone. Next, we have proximity. This is the distance between the person giving and receiving the orders. This would be affected by giving orders over the phone, and therefore we select proximity as our situational variable. Ruel attends an international school where students are from 30 different countries across the world. He decides to categorise them as individualistic or collectivist. Ruel decides to conduct interviews with students about their attitudes towards different groups of people and their beliefs about how communities should operate. He uses ideological statements that focus on prejudicial views within a given culture or outside of a given culture to prompt conversations with participants. He reviews each interview, giving it an overall prejudice score out of 20, with a higher score showing more prejudice. State an operationalised directional hypothesis for Ruel's study, 2 marks. Our first piece of psychological knowledge in this question is operationalised. By this, we mean how are we going to measure the IV and the DV in this study. We also need to be aware that this is a directional hypothesis, and we need to predict a certain outcome or direction for this study. As this is a STEM question, we need to take into account that this needs to link into Ruel's aim and be specific to this study in order to avoid being generic. Here's our response. Students from individualistic cultures will have a higher prejudice score out of 20 on ideological statements within a culture than students from collectivist cultures. We have a directional hypothesis here because we've got the word higher. By stating how we've measured culture in terms of being individualistic or collectivist, we've ensured that we've linked this into Ruel's study. We've also operationalised the DV in this study by saying the prejudice score is out of 20, and so we get both of our marks. Liam transfers to a new school, excited to express himself through his art and fashion. On his first day, he notices that most students wear neutral colours and trendy sneakers, while he stands out in his bright hand-painted jacket. During registration, the other students in Liam's form glance at his outfit and exchange looks. "Cool jacket," Jake says, smirking, "but if you want to fit in, you should check out the brands we wear." Liam laughs nervously, but feels a sudden pressure to wear different clothes tomorrow. Explain, according to your understanding of types of conformity, Liam's experiences of his new school, 4 marks. Here we have the command word explain, which means we need to give some extension to our description of our knowledge here. This question is looking at types of conformity, so we're talking about internalisation and compliance. All 4 marks for this question are application marks. This means we need to link them back into Liam's experiences and the information we have been given in the STEM. Here's our response. Liam may demonstrate compliance by wearing different clothes to school, but continuing to wear his bright hand-painted jacket at the weekend. Liam would show that he is going along with the views about neutral colours in public, whilst keeping his own views about bright clothes in private. We've shown our psychological knowledge about types of conformity here by identifying compliance. We've linked these into the STEM by talking about a different view about his hand-painted jacket at the weekend versus at school. We can tick this off in our STEM in order to show different types of the STEM and a broad form of application. We've shown our understanding of compliance, as that has different views in public than it does in private. We've linked this back into the STEM by talking about a difference between neutral and bright colours. Again, we're going to tick this off in the STEM to show that we've got broad application. We're then going to talk about a different type of conformity. If internalisation occurs, then Liam will change his private and public beliefs about which brands to wear. Liam will wear neutral colours both at school and how he dresses when people at school are not likely to see him. We've identified internalisation and also discussed that this is changing both private and public beliefs. We've linked this into the STEM by talking about the brands that Liam might wear. We're going to go back up to the STEM here and tick this off within our STEM. Again, we can see we've got 3 marks here because we talked about 3 different bits of the STEM for application. We've also identified that internalisation happens both when we're likely to be surveilled by the group and when we're not. We've clearly linked this into the STEM by talking about when people at school will and won't see Liam. And finally, we can tick this off within our STEM. In this question, we have the command word discuss. This means we need to explain for 6 marks, so we need 6 pieces of information about our resistance to social influence, how different theories might explain us not obeying or conforming. We then need to evaluate the different explanations we've given, and there are 10 marks of evaluation available. Therefore, we need more evaluation than explanation in order to balance our response. We're going to start with our first explanation of resistance. One way in which individuals may resist social influence is social support. Those with social support can feel more confident and will not fear rejection or ridicule. These individuals are more likely to resist conformity and remain independent. Ash found that the presence of social support enables an individual to resist conformity pressure from the majority. When the Confederate gave a correct answer in Ash's study, the conformity dropped to 5%. We've clearly identified an explanation through identifying social support. We've also said why this would make it more likely that people would resist conformity, as they do not fear rejection or ridicule. Using research from Ash showing how conformity drops with social support has bolstered and given us thorough detail for our explanation. We're then going to move into our evaluation. There is empiricism to support the role of social support in resisting social influence. We've shown our wider psychological knowledge by talking about empiricism, that we have evidence to support that social support is an explanation of resistance. We're then going to explain specific research evidence. Allen and Levine found that introducing a dissentant in an Ash-style study greatly reduced conformity levels, even if the dissenter wore thick glasses and claimed they had poor eyesight, supporting that having social support increases resistance to social influence. As such, even when the dissenter is not particularly well skilled at a task, social support from the dissenter still helps others to resist social influence. We've discussed specific findings here by talking about a great reduction in conformity levels during this study. We've also given specific details to show our thorough detailed knowledge about this particular piece of research, discussing that the Confederate had poor eyesight, and this didn't have an impact on levels of conformity, although the social support did. In order to develop well-constructed paragraphs, we're going to move on to a counter-argument next. However, the visual perception task lacks mundane realism and is superficial in relation to conformity in the real world. Social support may vary in the impact on resistance to conformity, depending on the nature of the task. Where we're talking about mundane realism, we're saying the task that the participants do within the study is not realistic. We've also said the impact of this on our explanation, that actually this might mean that the nature of the task itself is having more of an impact on resistance or conformity. We're going to move on here to give a mini conclusion or judgment. The conclusions about the impact of social support lack validity, and the role of social support may depend on the task and nature of resistance being required. Our conclusion clearly shows that the accuracy of this particular explanation is questionable. Our response is now going to move back into explanation. The timing of social support is also a significant factor in levels of resistance. If support is given to an individual quickly, then resistance to social influence is effective, as it confirms that the individual is correct in their own assertions. Again, we've identified an explanation through timing, but more importantly, we said why this has an impact, that it confirms that we're correct if it's done quickly, and if it's not done quickly, we start to doubt our own judgments. From here, we're going to go back to evaluation once again. The focus on laboratory experiments to examine the role of social influence lack validity. It's important here that not only we identify a specific research method, but we say the problems around it. Here we're saying that laboratory experiments may lack accuracy. And then we're going to explain why they lack accuracy. Conclusions about resistance to social influence may be invalid, and the consequence of demand characteristics shown by the participants in contrived situations that do not reflect their dissent in everyday life. We've used our psychological terminology effectively here, talking about the role of demand characteristics, that participants work out the aim of the study and change their behaviour. We've been clear about the impact of this for our specific question, talking about this not reflecting dissent that normally occurs. So we're saying the impact of this on resistance to social influence and the conclusions we've given so far. As we've started with a weakness in this evaluation paragraph, we're going to counter this with a strength. However, the strong research foundation for the role of timing is present. Allen and Levine found that if the confederate gave social support first rather than fourth, then the real participant who gave their response last was more likely to resist conformity. We've clearly shown research findings here, comparing responses given in the first and fourth position, explaining the impact of this on resisting conformity. Time for another conclusion. Deception and the role of confederates have been significant in conducting research into the resistance to social influence. However, concerns about the validity of findings remain. We've talked here about the need for deception and lying to our participants. We've also used psychological terminology in the role of confederates. These are actors or stooges who are in on the aim of the study. Time to move back to explanation. Here we're going to talk about locus of control. Locus of control also affects the ability to resist social influence. It refers to a person's perception of personal control over their behaviour. High internals are active seekers of information that is useful to them, so rely less on the opinion of others. They take responsibility for their own actions and base decisions on their own beliefs, and so resist pressure from others. High internals are also more self-confident and do not need social approval. Given that the focus of our essay is resistance to social influence, it's really important that we focus our discussion on internal locus of control, because those are the least obedient, the least conformist, and the most resistant to social influence. Then we're going to move on to evaluation. The type of social influence that an individual is being subjected to has an impact on whether locus of control is influential in resistance. Having already supported and opposed resistance to social influence and our different explanations, it's time to move on to a different theory or factor. Here we're talking about the type of social influence being most significant in whether locus of control has an impact or not. We're going to explain this factor with research. Spector measured locus of control and predisposition to normative and informational social influence. A significant correlation between locus of control and predisposition to normative social influence was found, with externals being more likely to conform than internals. However, he found no such relationship for the predisposition to informational social influence, with locus of control not appearing to be a significant factor in this type of conformity. In our explanation of research, we've been clear to identify findings, that there is a significant correlation with normative social influence or peer pressure of the group. However, there's no correlation with informational social influence, that the group is believed to be right and is providing information on how to act. This is giving a clear demonstration about how the type of social influence is actually being affected instead of just resistance and locus of control. We're going to give a counter-argument here in order to show our logical chains of reasoning. However, Agvis carried out a meta-analysis investigating the relationship between locus of control and different forms of social influence and found a significant positive correlation between scores of internal and external locus of control and scores on measures of persuasion. Individuals who scored highly on external locus of control tend to be more easily persuaded, more easily influenced, and more conforming than internals. We've been clear to identify findings within our discussion of research, with a positive correlation being found, that as scores for external locus of control increase, so do scores for measures of persuasion. We've also linked this back into our explanation by talking about the fact that externals are more likely to be persuaded and conform than internals. Again, it's really important that we have a conclusion around internals because we're talking about resistance to social influence. It's time for a judgment once again. The inconsistency of conclusions and the impact of social factors on levels of external and internal locus of control are likely to be confounding variables for explaining resistance to social influence. We've clearly identified wider psychological knowledge here, talking about confounding variables. These are uncontrolled extraneous variables that are affecting the results of research. It's time to go for a final explanation. Research has shown that individuals are generally more confident in their ability to resist the temptation to obey if they can find an ally who is also willing to join them in opposing the authority figure. We're showing thorough detailed knowledge here by also talking about obedience as a different type of social influence. We focused here on the presence of allies or friends who are also going against the authority figure. Our final piece of evaluation is going to focus on application to the real world. Examples of real-world resistance to obedience demonstrate the applications of social support. Here we're giving an example of real-world resistance, and we're going to go on to explain one in detail. Who you select is entirely up to you, and you might use a more topical example. As long as the examiner might be familiar with this, that's absolutely fine. We've gone for a historical example. The Rosenstrasse protest by Jewish women who resisted the threats of the Gestapo agents to demand the release of their husbands and sons despite extreme threats against them demonstrates the role of peers to give confidence to resist obedience. We've been clear in our historical example, explaining what happened and the impact of this on resisting social influence. In order to develop our evaluation, we're going to use research support. Furthermore, Milgram was able to replicate this dissent when participants were paired with two other teachers, or confederates, who refused to go on. The number of people who went up to 450 volts dropped to 10%. We've shown our understanding of Milgram's variations here by giving specific findings. We could make a comparison to the 65% in baseline in order to ram this home that these people did not obey when they had a confederate or a fellow dissenter or ally. It's time to give a judgment once again. Therefore, explanations have credibility as their explanation of real events demonstrates the validity of theories in resisting social influence. It's really important when we talk about real-world examples that we say that this means the explanations themselves are valid or accurate. We're going to bring this all together in our final conclusion. There is external reliability for the role of social support, as research findings have consistently demonstrated its impact in resisting social influence. The reliance on contrived scenarios and the need to control extraneous variables limits the accuracy of the conclusions about why individuals resist social influence. An explanation of social influence is complex and requires the examination of additional factors to explain the circumstances in which resistance to social influence occurs. Explanations for resisting social influence are demonstrated in real-world events, showing the accuracy of social support in resisting social influence. Draco is conducting a study to examine the capacity of memory. He decides to use a series of 20 pictures that are either landscapes, faces, or objects within his study. Draco shows the images to the participants for 15 seconds each in a series of slides and repeats this 3 times. The participants then select whether the image appeared in the original slides from a 6-photo array. Describe how Draco could implement a matched pairs design in his study. 2 marks. Here we've got the command word describe, which means we need to give details in our response, extending our discussion in order to maximise our explanation. We also need to bear in mind in this question that we need a matched pairs design, so we need to be matching our participants based on a participant variable in order to allocate them to the different groups. The final thing in decoding this question is that this is all about Draco and his study, so all of our discussion needs to link into his aim and what his study is about in order to show our application skills. Here's our answer. Draco could test the participants' ability to remember images on a different set of images and pair them based on their scores. He could then randomly allocate them to either the landscape, faces, or objects condition. We need 2 separate links to the STEM for our 2 application marks. First of all, we've talked about matching the participants based on a specific variable that's appropriate for this study. Here we've gone for the ability to remember images. The other thing we need to do in a matched pairs design is then randomly allocate 1 member from each of our pairs. And we've talked again about how this links back into the study because we've identified the different conditions in Draco's study. Explain one strength of Draco using a matched pairs design in his study. 2 marks. Our command word is explain. This means we need to give extension and detail to our discussion. The question is asking us for one strength, and so we want to focus our time and energy on effectively giving one strength. We need to focus our strength on a matched pairs design for Draco's specific study and the aim of his research. This means that our marks break down into 1 mark for identifying that strength in the context of Draco's study, and then another mark, a justification mark, of why that is a strength. It's important here we focus on the aim of the research rather than just name dropping and using Draco. Let's take a look at our response. It controls for some of the participants having a better memory naturally. We've identified a strength, and by discussing it in terms of memory, we've just about done enough to give some application to Draco's research. We then want to justify why this is a strength. This increases the validity of the findings and that the capacity of the memory for pictures is being tested rather than general abilities in memory. We've justified this control by talking about it in terms of validity or accuracy for this study. By discussing the accuracy of pictures rather than memory generally, we're ensuring that our strength is justified for Draco's aim. Discuss the working memory model. 8 marks. Here we've got the command word discuss. This means we need to explain and evaluate. We have 3 marks available for our explanation or our AO1 and 5 marks remaining for our AO3 or our evaluation, which means we need more evaluation than explanation, and it's really important that we balance our response in this way. Let's start by explaining a component of the working memory model. The central executive allocates and directs attention between the other components within short-term memory, making it responsible for processing information and verbal reasoning tasks. It has a supervisory role and does not store information. We've given a detailed explanation about the role of the central executive, discussing its role in certain tasks in terms of processing information and verbal reasoning, and that it does not store information. From here, we're going to evaluate. The central executive is difficult to test in isolation, limiting clarity about the exact role of this component. We've made a discrete point about a problem with the central executive. From here, we're going to give some research to support this point. Case study evidence from EVR suggests that the central executive may also be subdivided. EVR could complete verbal reasoning tasks, but not make simple decisions, suggesting further research about the central executive is needed. We've given clear conclusions from our research, saying that the central executive needs to be subdivided. We've used our understanding of the different types of tasks that the central executive is involved in order to secure this need, in that EVR could do verbal reasoning tasks but not make simple decisions. In order to develop our response, we're going to give a counter-argument. However, an individual's central executive function has a positive correlation with reading and note-taking ability, as well as an ability to give directions. Tests for working memory also have a role in the clinical assessment of schizophrenia, as an individual can have different abilities between their visual and verbal memory. We have several different applications here, all of which are saying a positive about understanding the central executive, in terms of reading and note-taking, giving directions, and its role in clinical assessment for schizophrenia. It's time to give a mini conclusion. Therefore, the current understanding of the central executive is reductionist and is unable to explain the role of this component within short-term memory. We've used our key terminology here by talking about the central executive's role being reductionist or too simplistic within the working memory model. We're then going to go back to explanation. The phonological loop encodes acoustically, but has a limited capacity in dealing with acoustic information. Within the phonological loop, there is the phonological store that stores the words that you hear. There is also the articulatory process that has a role in maintenance rehearsal. It's more important that we explain each part of the phonological loop rather than just identifying components. The fact that we've talked about its limited capacity and that it deals with acoustic information is critical. It's also critical that we talk about the difference between the subcomponents and that one stores the words that you hear whilst the articulatory process has a role in maintenance rehearsal. We're then going to evaluate this particular store. There is empiricism to support the separate functions of the slave systems within the working memory model. We've shown our psychological knowledge here by talking about the word empiricism, evidence to support a theory, making this more scientific. We're then going to explain our evidence. Chalice and Warrington examined the case study of KF following his brain injury. KF was able to complete visual tasks within short-term memory, but not verbal tasks, demonstrating that although his phonological loop was damaged, his visual spatial sketchpad remained intact. It's important when we're discussing research that we focus on findings, that KF could complete visual tasks but not verbal tasks, and also the impact of this on the model, taking this back to that his phonological loop was damaged but not his visual spatial sketchpad. We're going to give a counter-argument here, talking about a problem with the model. However, the use of brain-damaged patients to study memory is problematic, as they are idiographic, with each participant having a unique brain injury. As such, the working memory model may not be a consistent explanation of memory. It's important in our discussion of case studies as a method that we take this back to the model, explaining its impact on this particular theory. Here we've done so by talking about the fact that using unique brain injury patients may make the model inconsistent as an explanation for memory. To complete this evaluation paragraph, we're going to have a mini judgment. The working memory model may not be externally reliable in explaining the memory of all patients given its reliance on case studies. We've used the psychological term here, externally reliable. This means the consistency of findings across different pieces of research with different participants. It's time to return to explanation. The visual spatial sketchpad, which codes for visual and spatial information, but has a capacity of about 3 to 4 objects. It's subdivided into the visual cache that stores visual data and the inner scribe that records how objects are arranged. As we did with the phonological loop, it's important here when we're describing the visual spatial sketchpad that we are giving details about this component. It's more important that we explain different parts of it rather than just list out different features. We've done so by talking about its limited capacity and being specific about the number of objects that can be remembered. We've also talked about the role of both stores rather than just identifying them, which shows we understand the role of the visual cache and the inner scribe. Our evaluation is going to focus on the research methods that are being used. The examination of the role of subcomponents of the working memory model have relied on laboratory experiments to explore participants' abilities to complete different tasks, limiting its validity. We've linked our problems with laboratory experiments back into validity, talking about the accuracy of this particular research method. We're going to talk about specific ways in which laboratory experiments lack validity. Badley et al.'s dual task performance study lacks ecological validity, as the participants are tested in an artificial environment that does not replicate the same distractions as individuals would experience in the real world. The use of simple tasks to isolate extraneous variables also means that the tasks lack mundane realism and fail to replicate the nature of memory. We've got two different psychological terms here. Ecological validity is focused on the environment in which participants are tested, whereas mundane realism focuses on the tasks that they're used and those not being accurate. We're going to give a counter-argument here about how this experiment might be positive for the working memory model. However, Badley et al.'s dual task performance demonstrates the limited capacity of the phonological loop and the visual spatial sketchpad. When participants were asked to complete a visual and verbal task simultaneously, there was no difference than when the participants were asked to complete the task independently. When participants were asked to complete two visual tasks at the same time, performance was significantly impaired. In our discussion of Badley's research, we focused in on the different conditions and its findings. When a visual task and verbal task are completed at the same time, when their tasks are completed independently, or when two tasks from the same component are completed at the same time. And we're going to give a judgment about this discussion. The lack of validity in the methodological foundation of the working memory model may result in difficulties in generalising findings about the nature of memory. It's critical here we discuss the impact of these problems, saying that we're not able to generalise or use these results or apply them outside of the study. We're going to complete our essay by giving some final judgments. There is research evidence to support the subdivision of short-term memory, with each component having a different function within memory. The reliance on nomothetic approaches to research reduce the validity of the working memory model as an explanation for memory. The role of the central executive lacks clarity and is difficult to test in isolation, resulting in the model being incomplete. Geetha has been invited to take part in a case study looking at the impact of childhood experiences on brain activity, including the role of an urban environment. Describe what would be involved for Geetha to be a participant in this case study. 3 marks. Here we have the command word describe, which means we need to give an extension or development to our discussion to take it from a state into a describe point. Within this question, we also need to think about what would be involved. So we're thinking about it from the participant's point of view. What would they have to do if they were in this case study? Our final component in breaking down this question is what would be involved for Geetha. So we need to link this back into the aim of this particular piece of research and make all our examples relevant to the STEM. Let's jump into our response. Geetha may have a PET scan to see which regions of her brain are red, showing high levels of activity when she is recalling an event from her childhood. We've explained what might be involved in this case study by identifying that she might have a PET scan. We've also linked it back into the STEM by talking about high levels of activity in her brain being shown in red. This focuses on our STEM by talking about brain activity. Let's move on to a next point that she might expect. A psychologist could collect quantitative data by asking Geetha to complete the digit span test to record the capacity of her memory. We've also done just enough to link this into context by talking about memory, which is what the researcher is looking for. And then we're going to move into a final way for our 3rd mark in this 3-mark question. Geetha may be asked to recall an event from her childhood in detail and then asked to recall the event 3 weeks later to compare her accounts. Again, we've clearly got what she might expect from this study by being asked to recall a specific event. And we've got it linked into the details of this study by talking about a childhood event, which is ticked off in our STEM by the impact of childhood. Identify one aim from the classic study from Loftus and Palmer, 1974, 1 mark. Here we've got the command word identify, which means we need a specific statement in relation to our question. This question includes some assumed understanding about scientific language in terms of the aim. This needs to be the research question or something that they're looking to investigate within a particular piece of research. And this needs to be from Loftus and Palmer's study. Now it could be experiment 1 or experiment 2, both looking at misleading information. One aim that we could talk about for Loftus and Palmer's study is that memory can be fallible and influenced by post-event information. We've got a clear understanding of this being from Loftus and Palmer's study, in that memory can be false or problematic, fallible, and also that this is about post-event information, anything given after an event, after they've seen or witnessed something. A convenience store was robbed late at night, and the only witness is the cashier, Lisa. Detective James is assigned to interview her, although Lisa has been worried about the incident and has spoken to her friend about the possibility of being interviewed by the police. Here we have the command word discuss, which means we need to explain and evaluate in our essay. We know we need to be focused on the cognitive interview and what this entails in order to interview particular witnesses. This needs to be put into the discrete situation that Detective James finds themselves in. So we have 3 marks for our explanation of cognitive interview. We have a further 2 marks for our explanation of this in context, and then a final 3 marks for evaluating the cognitive interview. So this question is asking us to do all 3 of our exam skills. The start of our response is going to be explaining a technique within cognitive interview. Mental reinstatement of original context is one technique within the cognitive interview. It involves recreating the physical and psychological environment of the incident to make memories more accessible. Contextual and emotional cues by revisiting the incident in their mind might help give an individual cues to retrieve memories. We've given a detailed explanation of what's involved in this technique, that it's about recreating the physical and psychological environment. We've also been clear that this is about making memories more accessible through cues. Next, we need to apply this information to our particular scenario. Detective James encourages Lisa to mentally place herself back in the scene of the crime. Asking questions such as, try to picture yourself in the store before the robbery happened. What were you doing? What could you hear, see or smell? Lisa could close her eyes and imagine the moment before the suspect entered. We've got a clear link into the STEM here by including robbery in our discussion and the questions that the Detective James is asking. It's really important here that we do more than just use the names Detective James and Lisa. In our application, we want to use lots of bits of the STEM, so we've ticked robbery off here so that we know we're using a wide variety of material to show our application skills. Our next step is to evaluate. Research has found that cognitive interview is effective in increasing the amount of correct information recalled. So we've identified that there's research support and that this is making more factual and correct information gathered from the cognitive interview. Our next job is to explain some research findings. Cohen et al. Conducted a meta-analysis of 53 studies and found that cognitive interview increased correct recall by 34% compared to when standard interview was used to ask volunteer witnesses about what they could recall about an incident. We've given explicit research findings here by saying 34% more correct information was recalled. We're then going to give a conclusion about using cognitive interview. Therefore, cognitive interview implements understanding about retrieval failure in order to enhance the quantity of information collected from eyewitnesses and would be effective in Detective James's robbery investigation. We've shown our broader psychological knowledge here by linking this into theories of forgetting in terms of retrieval failure. We've also made sure that we've linked this back to the STEM by talking about that this would be important and useful for Detective James to use in their particular investigation. We're now going to repeat this process using a new part of cognitive interview. Here we're going to talk about report everything. The witness is encouraged to report everything without editing their account, so that they do not leave anything out even if it might not seem important. Report everything improves recall by using the interconnected nature of memory that a collection of small details from different witnesses might explain the incident as a whole. We've clearly explained what report everything involves and that we're not going to leave anything out. More importantly, we've explained why this is important. So we've talked about the interconnected nature of memory and how this might help an investigation. In order to ensure that we're hitting all the skills being asked of us in our question, we're going to move back into application. Here we're going to talk about how we would apply report everything. Detective James avoids leading questions and instead asks Lisa to describe the event in the convenience store in her own words by asking, "Tell me everything you remember, no matter how small or unimportant it may seem." We can go back up to our STEM here and tick off convenience store as a different part of the STEM that we have used. We're then going to evaluate cognitive interview once again. The quality of the information recalled by the witness may be problematic. This time we're talking about the quality of the information rather than necessarily the quantity. To explain our point, we're going to use some evidence. Coaken et al. Found an 81% increase in correct information using cognitive interview, but also a 61% increase in incorrect information compared to standard interview. Again, we've used specific findings in order to show our thorough detailed knowledge. An 81% increase, incorrect, but also a 61% increase in incorrect. And we're going to make a link back to our scenario. Therefore, Detective James would need to be cautious about the information Lisa gives about the robbery, as it may not be accurate. We focused in on this being a robbery once again to show that we've understood what the STEM and the scenario is really all about. We're then going to move into our final explanation of a technique within cognitive interview. Change order involves the interviewer changing the chronology of the events by reversing the order of the events. By discussing the events out of sequence, it is less likely for schema to affect the witness's recall, as it decreases the expectations that an individual might have about a particular crime. So we've explained what changing order is in terms of reversing the events. We've also talked about why this is important in that it disrupts schemas or expectations or blueprints in our memory. From here, we're going to go back to application. Detective James asks Lisa to recall the event in reverse order by using questions such as, "Let's go backward from when the suspect left. What did you see or hear as he was walking away from the cashier counter?" We've clearly linked this into the STEM by acknowledging that Lisa was the cashier, and we've also talked about the suspect leaving and going backward. We can go back up to the STEM here and tick off cashier, as this is a different part of the STEM that we have used in our application. We're then going to evaluate once again. There are practical issues with the implementation of the cognitive interview by the police. In our point here, we've acknowledged that it's the police who are likely to use this particular technique in memory. For our explain, we're going to develop some practical issues. Kebbel and Wagstaff found that the cognitive interview takes more time than the police have available to interview witnesses who prefer deliberate strategies to access the minimum amount of necessary information. Police officers would also need to complete hours of specialist training, which can be difficult to implement. We've got two different practical issues here: the time it takes to interview witnesses, but also the time it takes for the training necessary to do the cognitive interview. We're then going to link this back to the STEM. That Detective James would need to have undergone specialist training to implement cognitive interview effectively. We're going to come to some final concluding remarks. The high degree of specialist training means that the implementation of cognitive interview has been limited. Cognitive interview techniques are effective, producing more correct recall than existing interview techniques. And finally, techniques within the cognitive interview also increase the likelihood of incorrect information being recalled, so details between witnesses must be verified. Explain Lorenz's findings on animal attachment, 2 marks. Here we've got the command word explain, which requires us to give a bit more detail than just some statements or identifications. There's some assumed knowledge in this question in terms of findings. These are the results of a particular piece of research. These findings must all link to Lorenz's research rather than anything else for our marks available. We want 2 separate findings for the 2 marks in this question. The incubator group that imprinted on Lorenz followed him, but the control group that imprinted to the mother goose followed her. We've got a clear understanding of the 2 conditions and an action that happened, so which geese were following which group, and we've compared the incubator group with the control group. And then we're going to move on to our second finding. There is a critical period for imprinting that changes depending on the species. We've used key psychological terminology here in terms of a critical period. So this is a time in which it has to happen in terms of attachment and imprinting specifically. And we've said that this changes depending on the species. So lots of different species were tested by Lorenz, and we know that there are different critical periods depending on that animal. Outline how early attachment has had an influence on later life. 4 marks. Here we have the command word outline, which requires an extended explanation, giving thorough, detailed psychological knowledge. We're discussing the impact of early attachment on later life. Now that could be peers, parents, or indeed romantic relationships. Let's look at a response. The continuity hypothesis suggests that attachment style that infants demonstrate will follow them into their later relationships. Hazan and Shaver found a positive correlation between attachment style and love experiences, with securely attached adults describing love as trusting. Securely attached individuals were also likely to have lasting relationships, on average 10 years. We've identified key terminology in this question in terms of a continuity hypothesis, that attachment style in infants continues into adulthood. We've developed this further for a 2nd mark, talking about specific research in terms of a positive correlation between attachment style and love experiences. So as attachment style is more secure, love experiences are better. We've also talked about how this has an impact on how romantic relationships last, and we've given a specific finding here. We're going to move on to a different way in which attachment has affected later life, looking at parenting. And lack of early attachment is also found to have an impact on the quality of an individual's parenting as adults. Harlow found that socially isolated monkeys were sexually abnormal in their mating behaviours and did not cradle their own babies. We've identified our 2nd way by talking about parenting, and it's absolutely fine here that we've used Harlow's animal research to support these conclusions. We've talked about the animals being sexually abnormal because they were isolated and unable to learn, and that they had an impact on their parenting style in terms of them not cradling their own infants. Outline one way in which Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation has had an impact on the economy. 2 marks. Here we have the command word outline, which means we need to give a detailed description. It's important here we focus on maternal deprivation theory, as that's the focus of this question. We also need to have an awareness of what we mean by the economy. So here we're talking about workers and means of production in order to apply our psychological knowledge. It's also worth focusing on one way, and so you're only going to get credit for one way in which it has had an impact on the economy. It's really important here that you cross out any wrong answers in order for the examiner to focus in on the one that you do want marked. The 2 marks we have here are both application marks, so it's how we connect this idea of maternal deprivation and our understanding of that with the economy. We're looking at extending that way, so identifying a way and then extending how it has an impact on the economy in order to maximise our marks. Let's break down our response. Bowlby's work contributed to the 1950s World Health Organization report supporting the need for stay-at-home mothers to provide the constant care for their healthy children. As such, mothers were removed from the economy once they had children, limiting the availability of workers. We've identified within Bowlby's research the idea and need for constant care, and this resulted in stay-at-home mothers. We've gone a step further for that 2nd mark by talking about the link to the economy, that this limits the availability of these individuals, mothers particularly, as workers for the economy. Describe and evaluate the strange situation as an assessment of types of attachment, 16 marks. First we have the command word describe. Given that we have the strange situation, which is a method, we're being asked to describe the aim, procedure, findings and conclusions of that particular study. There are 6 marks available for our description, or our AO1 in this question. Our 2nd command word is evaluate. This is looking for us to give the strengths and weaknesses of the strange situation. There are 10 marks available for our evaluation, or our AO3, which means we need more strengths and weaknesses rather than description of the strange situation. The start of our response is going to be explaining the strange situation. The strange situation is a standardised procedure devised by Ainsworth and is used to investigate infant attachment by observing infants' behaviours during an 8-step procedure. Starting with a caregiver and infant alone, followed by a stranger entering and approaching the infant, the caregiver leaves while the stranger interacts with the child. The caregiver returns and the stranger leaves. Next, the caregiver leaves and the infant is left alone. The stranger enters and interacts with the infant, and finally the caregiver returns and greets the infant. We've explained different stages within this strange situation, starting with the willingness to explore with the caregiver and infant being alone. We've then looked at stranger anxiety and also separation anxiety. Finally, we look at how reunion behaviour is being assessed. Our next job is to evaluate the strange situation. The strange situation has high internal validity as the type of attachment was fully operationalised. Internal validity is the accuracy inside the study. Here we've talked about it has high accuracy because we've measured the variables appropriately. We're then going to explain why this is. The observation was conducted behind a one-way mirror to ensure that the presence of the researcher did not affect the observation of attachment. There are also set furniture positions and video footage of the tests. The one-way mirror shows that we are only testing the stranger, caregiver and infant interactions. By also having furniture positions, we know that the environment isn't changing, which might have an impact on the infant's behaviour. We're then going to give a counter-argument to develop detail in our evaluation. However, the strange situation lacks ecological validity as it was conducted in an artificial environment. The caregivers may show demand characteristics, changing their behaviour as attachment type was being assessed. That in turn had an impact on the infant's reactions. There are two ways in which we've shown our psychological knowledge here. Firstly, through a discussion of ecological validity, that the environment is artificial or different, which then changes the behaviour of the participants. We've then gone on to explain demand characteristics. It's really important here that we're talking about the changing behaviour of the parents. Remember that the participants are the infants, but they're only 1 year old, and therefore it's unlikely that they're going to work out Ainsworth's strange situation and change their behaviour. As we've said here, the parents might change because they know they're being studied in the attachment of their child, which might then have an impact on our infants who are our participants. Now it's time for an overall judgment about validity. Different attachment types may be shown in environments that the infant is more familiar with, reducing the validity of conclusions. We've focused here on the environments having an impact on the accuracy of our conclusions about types of attachment. We're going to go back now and explain a different aspect of the strange situation. The strange situation is designed to increase the infant's stress levels whilst maintaining internal validity. Participants are overseen by 2 observers who recorded exploratory and attachment behaviours. Once again, we've shown our understanding of the design and procedure of this particular experiment, talking about 2 observers who are recording the behaviours. We're going to explore generalisability next. The strange situation assumes that behaviours have the same meaning in all cultures, whereas understanding of behaviour differs greatly from one culture to another. The focus of our evaluation here is culture, talking about how culture might impact different attachment styles and observations within the strange situation. We're then going to give an exploration of how this is culturally biased. It's culturally biased as it was created and tested in the USA and will only reflect the norms and values of American culture. For example, most of the studies were analysed in Western countries and it is the American belief that attachment is related to separation anxiety. However, this may not be the case in other cultures like Japan. We've discussed a range of psychological terminology here, talking about the ways in which it's culturally biased. That the design of the study reflects the norms and values of American culture, specifically in terms of separation anxiety, which is important when it comes to attachment. We're going to elaborate this further by talking about research that supports the argument that the strange situation was culturally biased. Furthermore, Van Ningersdorm and Kroonenberg conducted a meta-analysis and found that there were bigger differences within culture than there were between them. They found that in some countries, such as USA and Germany, the intra-cultural variations is very large, but within others, such as the Netherlands and Japan, there is much less variation. It's important here when we're discussing research that we focus in on findings and give sufficient detail that we know the study that is being discussed. Here we've talked about intra-cultural variations, or those within a particular country. We've explained that there's bigger differences in intra-cultural variation in attachment than intercultural variation between different countries. And then we're going to give a mini judgment about generalisability. It is socially sensitive to assume that cultures have the same child rearing practices, which may have an impact on the type of attachment shown within the strange situation. Where we're talking about research being socially sensitive, we're saying that it has implications once it has been published, and that we may view certain cultures as insecure and problematic just because of the way we've typed attachment. Our explanation or description of the strange situation is going to move into looking at findings. Ainsworth identified 3 main attachment styles: secure attachment, which was shown by 66% of the individuals, insecure avoidant, shown by 22%, and 12% of the infants showed resistant attachment. Ainsworth concluded that these were the result of early caregiver interactions. Insecure avoidant infants appeared unfazed by the stranger or caregiver's departure and avoided contact on their return. However, securely attached children showed distress but were easily comforted. Insecure resistant infants didn't want to explore and clung to the caregiver. They showed severe distress when the caregiver left. We've shown our findings in 2 ways here. Firstly, by identifying the percentage of different types of attachment style that was shown by Ainsworth's strange situation. Secondly, we've clearly explained the behaviours shown by insecure avoidant, securely attached and insecurely resistant attached individuals. We're going to continue our evaluation of the strange situation talking about reliability. Ainsworth's strange situation is found to have high internal reliability as it achieves consistent results. When we're talking about internal reliability, we're talking about the consistency inside the study, that the experiences are the same for every participant. We're going to explain our point by giving some specific details. Observations can be accepted as reliable as inter-observer reliability was calculated at 0.94, showing a strong agreement between observers on the classification of infants' types of attachment. We've discussed inter-observer reliability here. This means 2 different observers coming to the same identification of attachment, so both of them saying that the child was securely attached, for example. We've used a correlational coefficient here, so we've got a positive number and it's closer to 1, which shows a strong positive agreement that both observers said the same attachment type. To elaborate on our evaluation, we're going to give a counter-argument here. On the other hand, the strange situation aims to measure infants' attachment type. However, it only measures the quality of one relationship rather than an internal personality variable. Main and Weston discovered infants behave differently depending on who they are with, affecting the consistency of an infant's type of attachment. By discussing Main and Weston's findings, we're talking about the inconsistency of attachment type, and that this is particularly affected by who they are having the observation with, and therefore our results might not be consistent. And then we're going to give a mini judgment about reliability. Therefore, as we are measuring one relationship rather than a character, classification of attachment type may not be a consistent assessment of attachment. We've linked this judgment straight back into the way that the question has been phrased, saying that we are inconsistent in our use of the strange situation to analyse attachment type because we're measuring a relationship rather than attachment. In order to address both skills, we're going to go back to describing the strange situation. As a result of her research, Ainsworth developed the caregiver sensitivity hypothesis to explain different attachment types. The maternal sensitivity hypothesis argues that a child's attachment style is dependent on the behaviour of their caregiver. She concluded that infants show proximity-seeking behaviours when separated from their caregiver, suggesting their caregiver is a secure base for most infants. To complete our description, we've talked about conclusions and the development of the maternal sensitivity hypothesis. We've linked this into the procedure still by talking about the caregiver being used as a secure base and how they are willing to explore from the caregiver. We're going to move back to evaluation. Intervention strategies have been developed based on attachment type, demonstrating the real-world applications of Ainsworth's research. We're making a clear point about the external validity of this in terms of intervention strategies and having a real-world impact. To explain this point, we can use any example. We've gone for the Circle of Security. The Circle of Security project teaches caregivers to identify when infants are showing distress and increase the understanding of caregivers' feelings of anxiety. Whichever example you select, it's important here that we explain the purpose of it. And here we've said that we're teaching the caregivers to understand signs of distress. Our elaboration is going to explain the impact of our example. As a consequence of taking part in the programme, there was a significant decrease in the disorder attachment style from 60 to 15%, as well as an 8% increase in the number of infants classified as securely attached. We've shown off our psychological knowledge here by including percentages, that it's moved from 60 to 15%, so less participants, less of the children are having a disordered attachment type, and we've also said 8% have increased in being securely attached. From this, we're alluding to the fact that securely attached children is beneficial. And then we're going to give a mini judgment about applications. Therefore, the practical applications of conclusions demonstrate the credibility of the types of attachment identified by the strange situation. It's really important in our evaluation here that we explain why the application is important. If we can apply findings to the real world, then we know that they're valid and credible, that the strange situation is actually identifying attachment type, and we can explain this and apply this to the real world. We're going to give a final conclusion about the role of the strange situation in assessing attachment type. Within a conclusion, it's important that we don't include what we think, but more that what research has told us. The ethnocentric development of the strange situation shows imposed ethics when conducting cross-cultural research. Imposed ethics are when we assume things are universal when actually they're culturally specific. The standardised procedure and high levels of inter-observer reliability demonstrate the strong consistency of the strange situation. The accuracy of the strange situation is compromised by the artificial environment that the observation was conducted in. And finally, by recognising types of attachment, carers can be equipped with skills to improve interactions, suggesting the validity of Ainsworth's research. Evaluate statistical infrequency as a way of defining mental health, 2 marks. Here we have the command word evaluate, which means we're just giving strengths and weaknesses. We need to apply this to statistical infrequency and ensure that our evaluation only links to this particular way of defining mental health. In order to get our 2 marks, we want to identify a particular strength or weakness and justify why that is a strength or a weakness for this particular definition of mental health. Our response has looked for a weakness of statistical infrequency. Statistical infrequency fails to take into account that some behaviours that fall outside of 2 standard deviations from the mean may be positive. A high IQ is statistically infrequent but may be considered a desirable behaviour, whereas depression is relatively common but is less desirable. We've identified our problem within statistical infrequency, that actually those behaviours that are outside of 2 standard deviations may be positive rather than negative. We've then given an example, a high IQ, infrequent but positive, whereas depression, something more frequent and maybe less desirable. Oscar is conducting a study to investigate the relationship between clinical experience and positive interactions with patients. He collects data on the number of years that different clinicians have been qualified. He also conducts cross-sectional research, asking patients to complete questionnaires about their daily experiences in 10 different inpatient facilities. Table 1. Mean number of positive interactions per day and the number of years the clinicians have been qualified. Less than 2, 5.2, 2 to 5, 8.9, more than 5, 4.5. Draw a bar chart to show the mean results of Oscar's study using the data from Table 1, 3 marks. Here we have the command word draw, which means it's looking for us to actually draw out and sketch out this particular bar chart. The first thing we want to do is draw out our axes. And then we want to put a scale on both axes. Now it doesn't really matter which one we do on which axis for the purpose of psychology, but we're going to make our life a little bit easier and we're going to put our mean number, our frequencies up the side. And then we're going to start to plot our points. So we've got 5.2 here. And because we've got a bar chart, we want to leave a space so our bars don't touch. And we're going to put 8.9 about here. And then we're going to put 4.5 in here. And that gets us one of our marks because we've accurately plotted our points. So our next thing to do is label our axis. So this is less than 2. This is between 2 and 5. And this is more than 5. Well, what is this in relation to? Well, this is the number of years of clinician experience. And then we need to label our other axis. So this is the mean, and what is it the mean of? Mean number of positive interactions. And finally, we need to give our whole graph a title. So we're going to say bar chart to show. And we need to put both our IV, and that completes our graph, and also our DV, which completes our graph. Here's one I prepared earlier. Our bars have a gap between them and they are accurately plotted. That's 1 mark. We've got both of our labels operationalised, the number of years for the clinicians being qualified and the mean number of positive interactions per day. We have both our IV, the years of experience of the clinician, and the DV, mean number of positive interactions, in our title. So we get all 3 marks. Oscar is concerned about the reliability of his data and so decides to ask patients to complete the questionnaire at the beginning and the end of each day. Explain one reason why Oscar used a Wilcoxon t-test in this study. 2 marks. Here we've got the command word explain, which requires us to give some detail and development in our explanation. This question is asking about a Wilcoxon t-test specifically. It's worth noting here that we only need to give one reason, but also that this needs to be linked back into Oscar's study and the information given about this particular study. We need a way of remembering our different statistical tests, and we use Never Chuck, Chocolate Sponge, In My, Red Wellies, Spur. So if we have nominal data, we're going to do a chi-square. Anything below this is not nominal, so all of these tests are at least an ordinal level of data. Next, we need to examine whether our study is correlational and a test of relationship. Any of our tests on this side is going to mean that it's parametric data, whereas on our other side, that's going to mean that we've got non-parametric data, which is another decision. Next, we need to examine our stem of whether we've got an independent groups design or not. And finally, whether it's a repeated measures design or not. For this question, we know we have a Wilcoxon t-test, so we're using our decisions in order to decide why we've got this test. So we're talking about it being a repeated measures design, that it's a test of difference rather than a correlation, and that there's at least ordinal data. Remember, the question is only asking us for one reason, so let's have a look at our response. Oscar chose a Wilcoxon t-test because he has a repeated measures design, where the same participants are tested at the beginning and end of each day using the questionnaire. Our first mark comes from correctly giving a reason, that Oscar has chosen a Wilcoxon t-test because he has a repeated measures design. In a repeated measures design, we know it's the same participants that are being tested. Here we've linked it into the stem by saying they're tested at the beginning and end of each day. Oscar used a directional one-tailed hypothesis. The calculated value was 6.5 and the number of participants was 6, with 1 having no difference between the two conditions. State whether Oscar's data were significant at p equals 0.05, 1 mark. The command word here is state, so we're giving a specific sentence about our question. We have some assumed psychological knowledge here in terms of significance, whether these results are from chance or not. We need to use the information from Oscar's study in order to make our response relevant. As one of the participants had no difference, we are actually excluding them from our study completely. So rather than having 6 participants, we've actually got 5 participants taking part in our study. There are some other pieces of information from our STEM that we need for our critical values table. That this is a directional or one-tailed hypothesis, and that the level of significance is 0.05. So we've got a one-tailed test or a directional hypothesis, and we're using a level of significance at 5%, so we're going down this column here. And we had 5 participants in our study because we excluded one that had a difference of 0, which means that our critical value is 0. So the first thing we're going to write in our answer is our critical value, and our critical value was 0. And then we need to identify our calculated value within our STEM, which is 6.5. And we're going to compare these two values in our answer. So 6.5 is bigger than 0. This is going to determine whether our results are significant. So the results are not significant. This is because 6.5 is bigger than 0. It will always tell you at the bottom of the table which way round it needs to be significant. Discuss the biological approach to explaining obsessive-compulsive disorder, 16 marks. Here we have the command word discuss. This means we both need to describe and evaluate in our response. We're focused on a biological approach to explaining OCD for our marks. This breaks down into 6 marks of explanation or AO1 and 10 marks of evaluation in terms of strengths and weaknesses, which means we need more evaluation than explanation in order to balance our response. We're going to start with our explanation. Genetic explanations as part of a biological approach suggest that OCD is inherited and that individuals inherit specific genes which cause OCD. Genetic explanations have focused on identifying particular genes which are implicated in OCD, including the COMT gene. The COMT gene is associated with the production and regulation of dopamine. One variation of the COMT gene results in higher levels of dopamine, and this variation is more common in patients with OCD in comparison to people without OCD. We've clearly identified a biological explanation talking about genetics, suggesting that OCD itself might be inherited. Our discussion of the COMT gene identifies particular variants appropriate for OCD, and we've identified that this affects dopamine. Here we've recognised that family studies are going to be an appropriate methodology in order to investigate the biological approach. We've got specific findings here with our percentages. It's also important here that we're talking about parents and siblings having a high percentage, with parents having a higher percentage because they're most likely to be genetically connected to an individual. We're going to elaborate by discussing additional research. Further support for the biological explanation of OCD comes from twin studies that provide strong evidence for a genetic link. Nesdat et al. Conducted a review of previous twin studies examining OCD. They found that 68% of identical twins and 31% of non-identical twins experience OCD. For our genetic link to be true, again it's important that monozygotic or identical twins have a higher percentage of OCD than non-identical twins. This is because identical twins or monozygotic twins are genetically identical. We're going to give a mini judgment next to round off this evaluation paragraph. Therefore, genetic explanations have external reliability, with similar findings supporting a genetic link. We've shown off our psychological knowledge here by talking about external reliability, that consistent findings have been found with different participants across different pieces of research. We're then going to move into our next piece of explanation. Another gene that has been implicated in OCD is the SERT gene or the 5-HT gene. The SERT gene is linked to the neurotransmitter serotonin and affects the transport of the serotonin, causing lower levels of serotonin, which is associated with OCD as well as depression. Not only have we identified an appropriate genetic variant, we've explained its link to neurotransmitters in the form of serotonin, and that lower levels of serotonin are linked into OCD, which is the disorder that we're trying to explain. We're then going to move back to evaluate once again, this time focusing on problems. Genetic explanations rely on concordance rates that are never 100%, which suggests that other factors may have a role in explaining OCD. When we're using the term concordance rates, we're saying the percentage of time twin A and twin B, or person A and person B who are related, are diagnosed with the same clinical disorder. We're going to explain this further by explaining why twin studies are problematic. Twin studies are also problematic as similarity may be due to their shared environment and identity confusion rather than genetics. The equal environment assumption reduces the validity of twin studies and, as a consequence, the accuracy of genetic explanations. The equal environment assumption suggests that both monozygotic and dizygotic twins are treated similarly. In fact, more likely is that monozygotic twins are treated more similarly than dizygotic twins. This reduces the accuracy, and we haven't necessarily separated out nature from nurture when we're talking about twin studies. We're then going to elaborate further. Furthermore, the diathesis stress model suggests that the complexity of OCD is better explained by genetic variants producing a vulnerability for OCD, but that environmental stressors, such as a traumatic event, are needed for an individual to start experiencing symptoms of this disorder. By incorporating the diathesis stress model, we're giving an interactionist approach of how nature and nurture might work together in order to explain OCD. We're then going to come to a mini conclusion. The validity of a biological approach to explaining OCD is limited, given problems with its methodological foundation. Again, we've tied this back to validity, that the accuracy of these explanations is halted by the inaccuracies of the methods that are being used to test biological explanations. And then we're going to move back again to discussion and explanation. The neurotransmitter serotonin is believed to play a role in OCD. Serotonin regulates mood, and lower levels of serotonin are associated with mood disorders. Some cases of OCD are also associated with the reduced levels of serotonin, which may be caused by the SERT gene. We've returned to discuss neural or neurotransmitters as an explanation for OCD, this time focusing on serotonin and low levels of serotonin being linked to OCD. In order to progress with our response, we're going to move back to evaluation. Support for the role of serotonin in OCD comes from research examining antidepressants, which have found that drugs which increase the level of serotonin are effective in treating patients with OCD. Our evaluation is now looking at application in terms of antidepressants as a particular form of drug therapy used to treat OCD. We're going to explain this by talking about how antidepressants work. Antidepressants typically work by increasing the availability of the neurotransmitter serotonin by binding to reuptake channels on the presynaptic receptor. As serotonin remains in the synapse, it is more likely to bind to the postsynaptic receptors. These drugs are effective in reducing symptoms of OCD and provide support for a neural explanation of OCD. It's important in our discussion that we discuss how the availability of serotonin is being increased. It's not that the vesicles produce more serotonin, it's that more is available in the synapse because those reuptake channels are blocked. It's also important here that we talk about the reducing of symptoms, and that's why that they are effective. We're going to elaborate further here by talking about research support. Sumru et al. Conducted a meta-review of SSRIs and found them to be more effective than placebos in treating OCD up to 3 months after treatment. SSRIs are a particular type of antidepressant or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. When we're comparing them to placebos, we're comparing them to no treatment in terms of, or the treatment just being given in terms of a sugar pill. It's important here that we've said that they're more effective, and the length of the effectiveness also supports antidepressants as an effective treatment for OCD. We're going to give a conclusion now. Neural explanations for OCD are valid because the treatments based on these explanations are effective. This sentence is critical in order to make our discussion about treatments relevant to our explanations or approaches essay. The fact that we've discussed that these are valid, that the effectiveness of the treatment means that the explanation in terms of neurotransmitters must be true. It's time to return to explanation once again. In addition, the neurotransmitter dopamine has also been implicated in OCD, with higher levels of dopamine being associated with some of the symptoms of OCD, in particular the compulsive behaviours. When animals have high doses of drugs that are dopamine agonists, they show stereotypical movements of the compulsive behaviours found in individuals with OCD. We've identified that it's higher levels of dopamine that are associated with OCD. Where we're talking about dopamine agonists, we're talking about drugs that increase the action and availability of dopamine in the synapse. Our final piece of evaluation is to talk about a different theory. One weakness of the biological explanation for OCD is that it ignores other factors and is reductionist. Where we're discussing reductionism, we're saying that this explanation is too simplistic. We could go one step further here and talk about this being biologically reductionist and just focusing on physical differences. We're going to explain this by giving an alternative explanation. The biological approach does not take into account cognitions and learning. Behaviourists suggest that OCD may be learnt through classical conditioning and maintained through operant conditioning stimulus, for example dirt, is associated with anxiety, and this association is then maintained through operant conditioning, where a person avoids dirt by continually washing their hands. Hand washing reduces their anxiety and negatively reinforces their compulsions. We've talked about key terminology within the behaviourist approach. Not only have we identified theories through classical and operant conditioning, we've explained these specifically for OCD, that dirt is associated with anxiety and is maintained by avoiding dirt and washing our hands. The hand washing is a negative reinforcement in order to continue those compulsions. We're then going to give a counter-argument. Although there are differences in neural systems and brain structures of individuals with OCD, as it may be that these are the result of OCD rather than the cause of it. We've returned to the biological approach suggesting that there are differences, but here we're talking about this idea of consequentiality, that actually because of OCD our neural mechanisms might change rather than the neural mechanisms changing and then an individual experiencing OCD. And then we're going to give a mini judgment. A holistic approach is needed to fully explain the complexities of OCD as a clinical condition. Here we're suggesting that a holistic or a complete explanation is required, with biopsychosocial explanations all being included in order to fully explain OCD. We're going to end with a balanced conclusion. There is external reliability for the biological approach to explaining OCD, as research findings have consistently demonstrated genetic explanations. The reliance on correlational methods limits the validity of biological explanations. A biologically reductionist approach to explaining OCD fails to take into account the clinical complexities and is an incomplete explanation. And finally, the positive applications of the biological explanations in effective development of treatments for OCD demonstrate their validity. You can complete a unique version of this paper by going to our Psychology Ninjas site. Psychology Ninjas is full of free content to help you with your exams. You can save your scores with a free account.